Good morning, folks. It is still the morning. Welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel. I released a vlog yesterday on the 2nd. I encourage you to watch it. But I had been listening to a lecture by Dr. Stephen Hicks on Nietzsche and Ayn Rand. And he was mentioning that they had some superficial similarities, but when you really investigate the differences between the two, they were quite drastic. I'll tell you a little story. I am a former musician whose stage name was Mojo Willie. I called myself Mojo as a joke because of the tune that Muddy Waters had made famous. I got my mojo working, but it just don't work on you. And because I ain't a superstitious man, I didn't believe anything in life was the result of good luck. It was more likely to be the result of applying oneself and perhaps being in the right place at the right time too, but that also involves deliberately placing yourself into places where there's opportunity. I have always wondered about mojo. There's a juju behind everything. There's a mindset behind all ideologies. And ideologies, as Dr. Jordan B. Peterson has often stated, are parasites on religious substructures. They're also parasites on philosophy. Politics is a very low resolution manifestation of a person's inner mojo. So, since Norway in particular, I have been extremely interested in the mindset behind socialism. How do people find groupthink attractive? And in listening to Dr. Hicks talking last night on, and I'll post the link here below this video, speaking last night on Nietzsche and Rand, he got into Hegel and what Hegel's view was. And it's really remarkable to me that all of this collectivist mentality came out of Germany. So I paraphrased what Dr. Hicks stated, and I'll read that paraphrasing to you now, and then I'm going to discuss my take on this mindset. Here is an example, not from Nietzsche, but another exaggerated example to illustrate a point from Hegel, who was kind of an exaggerated philosopher himself. Hegel, I think, has certainly led many thinkers astray. When they read Hegel, any kind of ringing endorsements of freedom and true self-realization, Hegel will say that freedom means realizing your true self. And then those of us who are liberals and self-realization moralists find room to respond with feeling like, wow, Hegel is one of ours. But then you have to ask, what does freedom mean to Hegel? What is truth to Hegel? What is the self to Hegel? And then you go on to read that by true self, Hegel means realizing that you are not really a unique, separate individual, but merely an aspect of what he calls a collective absolute self. So your true self is to realize that you're an aspect of a collective self, and then put those two propositions together. First, realizing that freedom is realizing your true self, and your true self is an aspect of this collective self. And then it follows that freedom means realizing the absolute collective self. But then we have to follow up again with, what is this collective absolute self? And here Hegel goes on to say that the collective absolute self is realized in the state. In the government in practical, concrete terms, and in the state in abstraction. And that the government in concrete terms is the realization of the absolute self along with its plans and goals and purposes for the world. So logically, again, if freedom is realizing the absolute self, and the absolute self is realized in the state, then freedom means doing what the state tells you to do. So Hegel places us in the position of saying, quite logically, that obedience to and submerging yourself into whatever the state has dictated, that's what true freedom and true self-realization are. Obviously, he was in a very different philosophical universe from those who start by saying that freedom is realizing your true self in a liberal, individualistic, enlightenment way. So, we can see that this mindset of being an extension of another is extremely prevalent in Europe. However, there are parts of the world where that was not the case. In Great Britain, there was always an idea that the individual was the most fundamental, important aspect of the rule of law, that each person was endowed with rights, and back to Magna Carta and prior, that these rights were recognized, and that the state must never trample on those rights. The king was at once trying to encourage one of his judges to do something that broke faith with Magna Carta, and that judge said to His Majesty, Magna Carta is such a fellow as will have no sovereign. These ideas led through the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment to values that founded North America, that strongly place the individual at the center of importance and the state in a place of subordination to the individual. This is why, in a Western democracy, all of us have the right to vote to help steer the ship of state. All of us are deemed to be equal before the law, and that Lady Justice must remain blind to our identity, so that she will treat all identically before her. Whenever her blinders are torn off, and people of wealth and power and prestige are granted special favor before the law, then the law is no longer being applied blindly. And then we go back to this idea that because the state is a law unto itself, that whatever the state dictates, that is what the individual must subordinate themselves to. This is nothing other than an extension of the absolute monarchism of the Dark Ages, of serfdom, of reducing people to a pawn in a game that they don't control. I find this to be a hideous ideology. And it's not surprising that it's come to Canada in its most latent form through Justin Trudeau. I'm going to offend many, but I'm going to tell the story anyway. My pop was taking us out to the East Coast. And of course, getting from Ontario to the East Coast requires you to drive through La Belle Provence. We stopped in the middle of a wee village, huge cathedral in the village. We got out and Dad pointed at and said, Billy, see that church? The only two educated people in this village are the priest in that church and the medical doctor. That church keeps these people ignorant and subservient to the land. What do we do in Ontario? We build a small white clapboard building, hire a preacher. If we didn't like what he preached, we'd fire him and get somebody else. The people ran the church, not the church the people. They blame us Anglos for their oppression. There's the real source of their oppression today. That's what Papa told me. And Papa had some wisdom when he said that, because now that the church is no longer so ascendant in the collectivist state of Quebec, because they view themselves as a nation within a nation, the state has taken the place of the church, and the state is supreme. And it's no mistake that Trudeau came from there. In living in Norway, there was absolutely no sense of self outside of the state-run collective. And they were utterly unaware of the blatant contradictions that existed within the system that they had created. When attending Norskurs, Norwegian course, I was paying to go to school. I was the only one who was, by the way, in the entire school in Moss. Okay? Everyone in school, except myself because I was paying, had to attend a special class that had nothing to do with language and nothing to do with learning about Norwegian ethics. They were training people to clean houses and clean office buildings. So they were deliberately creating a subservient servant class. Even though many of the people whom I went to school with had master's degrees and were brilliant. Teaching them how to clean an office, it's wonderful to know how to clean a house, but I'm sure most people's moms taught them how to do that. They were deliberately creating an underclass while talking about themselves as being snille og gode, how kind and good they were. Social collectivism is an absolute rejection of the very nature of our humanity, and I hate it with a loathing, writhing, flaming passion. Start reading some philosophy and start understanding exactly where our government is taking us. Our ancestors left us wisdom on how to create limited, constitutional, responsible government that would answer to each citizen individually. And we have a right to access our members of parliament and members of provincial parliament and hold their bloody feet to the fire and make sure that they are carrying our voice to the floors of legislatures throughout this country. I am so fed up with the idiocy that I hear and the stupid things that I hear from fellow Christians who say things like render unto Caesar, as though that excuses, if it's wonderful how they can pick and choose scriptures out of the Bible to justify their own silly anti-intellectual position. It's absolutely remarkable. The Lord wanted Israel to be governed by judges. Why? Because it's the law that keeps you from screwing me and me from screwing you. That's why the law is all important. And the Lord warned him if they got a king, the state was going to become supreme and they'd be subjected to tyranny. So there's the real truth from the scriptures that every Christian that I've ever heard say, render unto Caesar what Caesar. We don't have Caesar as our government anymore. And it's because of Christians. It's because of the age of enlightenment. It's because of documents like Magna Carta that we have limited constitutional responsible government in Canada. And by the way, we don't have a leader. Okay? We don't have leaders in Canada. We never have had leaders in Canada. We have had elected representatives who were supposed to serve for a term and then go back to being private citizens, equal to the rest of us before the law. Wake up. You people know nothing of your own history. And it's unforgivable. And there's another thing that's unforgivable about these postmodern Christians that are dancing to the tune of this world. You don't seek after wisdom. And you know nothing of even the history of your own faith. Harriet Tubman, who was a radical Protestant, brought people to Upper Canada out of indentureship and slavery. In this Black History Month, we ought to remember Harriet lived in my hometown, which was the end of the Underground Railroad in Canada. This is to be a place of liberty and freedom for all. And it will only remain so if we demand it. Wake up, start reading, start praying about these matters, because we're in a desperate situation and we're starting to think like them noggies do, like the Borg. Resistance is futile. Lower your shields. We are here to collect your biological distinctiveness into making the collective that lower your shields. Buzz, click. Do resistance. Do not resist. I'm dying of resistance.